Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. John H. Anderson had a distinguished career of some 35 years in the Ministry of Agriculture of Great Britain and had a vital concern for the production of food in Great Britain and later throughout the world. On his retirement from the Ministry of Agriculture, he went with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, where he spent 5 years. He more or less directed the World Food Program for that organization in the technical department. Now, there are other departments of FAO, and although I spent a year sabbatical there, I never did figure out what the other departments did or what they accomplished. To me, the technical department was FAO. And Mr. Anderson now has concluded that 5 years service with FAO, where he traveled the world over studying and working on food problems. And he is spending the fall quarter at UCR. I became acquainted with him during my 1964-65 sabbatical, and it was with a great deal of pleasure that I learned that he was to be at Riverside this fall. And I immediately took steps to schedule his appearance here. I'm sorry that maybe we didn't make the right pitch or something. We didn't get the crowd out we thought should come to hear Mr. Anderson speak, who is now Regents Professor at University of California, Riverside. I give you Mr. Anderson.
You'll excuse me half a minute. They tell me I've got to put this on to make sure I don't run away. But I've got the idea of... No, not quite right. That's fine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to me to be invited to come this evening and talk to you about one of the biggest problems which are facing mankind at the present time. Next to the preservation of peace, surely securing a good life for millions and millions of people is one of the most important things that we can give our attention to in the coming years. Just listen to this. From my throne I grieve over this calamity. During my reign the Nile has not been in flood for 7 years. Corn is scarce and food is lacking. Men have become thieves and pillage their neighbors. Those who would run cannot even walk. Children cry, and the young stagger like old people. Their legs drag and give way under them. Their spirits are broken. The council chamber of the nobles is deserted. The food bins are broken and empty. This is the end of everything. That is the world's first record of hunger. It was found chiseled on a stone in a tomb in Egypt. It was written 4,000 years ago. There's nothing new then about hunger. There never has been enough food for everybody in the world. There probably never even was a golden age when what food there was equally divided among the world's peoples. Neither has opportunity come equally to all. The great industrial revolution which we triggered off for ourselves primarily benefited those already ahead in the race for development and had very little message indeed for the undeveloped countries. Similarly, the great technical and scientific upsurge which has altered our lives in almost every aspect in the past 10 to 15 years has had very limited message for the developing peoples. It's benefited ourselves. As a result of the application of science and technology to the field of agriculture, we who live on the sunny side of the world have more food to eat than we've ever had before. We have more to sell. Indeed, there is more food than we can eat or sell. Yet on the other side of the world, millions of people just never get enough to eat. You might envisage a sort of gap had opened up between us on the one side who are fortunate and those on the others who lack so much. On the other side of this gap stand the undeveloped areas of the world, collectively more than 100 different countries and totaling a population of something like 1,000 million people. And if you add to this number the population of mainland China, there you have more than half of the world's peoples who just never get enough to eat. There are more human lives hanging in the balance today than there have been killed in all the wars of history. That's the size of the task we have before us. What has caused this situation? Hunger stems from poverty. Now, poverty is a much wider thing than just being short of money. Though, in terms of money, the average earnings of people who live on the undeveloped side of the gap are not higher than $3 a week. Very few indeed earn as much as $15 a week. They are short of money, but they're also short of other things too. They're short of knowledge. They haven't got the experience that we've got on this side of the gap. They're short of resources, the better seed, the fertilizer, even short of water, short of machinery, short of equipment, short of almost everything that makes farming such a big business here in your country. They are short of encouragement. They are short of opportunity. And indeed they are short of an environment in which progress is possible. There is nothing new then about hunger, but what is new is that we know much more about it. We know much more today about its causes. We know much more how to combat these problems of hunger. More people and their governments are anxious to do something to alleviate hunger, and more people are prepared to share their knowledge with those who live on the other side of the world who so desperately need it. As a result of the development of science and technology in the developed areas of the world, for the first time in history, we now find ourselves in the position of knowing that there is no continuing physical reason why hunger should exist anywhere in the world. We have the knowledge, we have the experience which could provide food for everybody. There's no need to wait for more information, no need to wait for more experiments, no need to wait for more knowledge. We have enough knowledge today to feed the world. The real problem is not then a shortage of knowledge so much as a very slow rate of application of what is already known in the areas where food is so very short. The problem has an added urgency as a result of the rapid increase in the world's population which has occurred during the past years of this century. There are more people today in the world than there have ever been before. There is more food too, but unfortunately it is not equally divided. In the past, the balance between those who were born and those who died was roughly equal. In those long gone days, if the population increased to the extent to which the local food supply could not feed, then the equilibrium was made equal again as a result of famine, as a result of pestilence. And the population was reduced to the size which local food production could support. Today we have drastically altered this balance between life, between birth and death. By the widespread application of modern scientific knowledge as applied to health, we have eradicated in many areas such diseases as cholera, yellow fever, and typhus, which made such an inroad into people's lives in those days. We've upset the balance between those who are born and those who die. We haven't yet had enough time to re-establish this kind of balance. Every year, more than 70 million people come to live with us. Every day, a number come equivalent to a column of people marching 4 abreast and for over 27 miles. They come to live with us every day, demanding not only food, but shelter, clothing, water, and 101 things which makes life so comfortable for us here. The view is widely held and frequently repeated that there's no possible economic or social development is likely unless something is done first to regulate the number of people who are born. I do not believe this is true. I believe that these two problems of feeding people and of controlling numbers to more equally equate with the availability of food are two separate but quite individual problems. Both have got to be separately tackled. Both will probably be tackled the same way. It is unlikely, you see, that the application of knowledge to the regulation of the population is likely to come about as a result of government manifesto. Similarly, speeches by government authorities isn't going to increase food production. We're going to solve both of these problems the same way. That is, by persuading millions of people to take individual action on their own, millions of people to regulate the size of their families as they find convenient, and millions of peasant farmers to produce the food which the population will need. Admittedly, the multiplication of needs which follow a rapidly rising population make the great problem of feeding those already with us a good deal greater. But nonetheless, it is, I don't think, sensible to say that nothing is possible until the population growth is controlled. In the meantime, since whatever is done between now and the end of the century is not likely to affect the size of the population, there are enough girl children born already to take the population over 6 billion by the end of this century. Clearly then, increasing the food supply is of paramount importance at this stage. The key to this problem is the application of the knowledge and experience which we have here on the western side of the world to the age-old processes of husbandry on the other side. This is the only key which will open the door leading to freedom from hunger. Just giving food, even if it were possible on a big enough scale, isn't likely to solve the initial problem. Indeed, just giving people food might very well undermine their will and their desire to do something for themselves. If people are going to feed better, it's going to be because they are shown how to grow food for themselves in their own countries. To teach the peasant farmers, numbered by the hundreds of millions, better ways of doing things, better ways of solving some of the problems which have hampered his development for so long, better ways of producing food where it is most needed. This is easier said than done. Peasants aren't easily moved from their old ways. They aren't easily persuaded to try something new. And this is true all over the world. I recall very well in the 1930s when Great Britain, when England was suffering from a great agricultural depression, how difficult it was for those of us working in the extension service to persuade farmers to try something new, to try a new variety of seed which would yield better, to try better equipment, simply because he was anxious, the farmer was anxious not to try something which might carry with it the seeds of failure. How much more true is it today when many of these farmers are living on the very knife edge of starvation? Every new idea to a peasant farmer carries with it the possibility of failure. If it fails, it carries with it loss of faith in the community and undoubtedly added privation where he is living for himself and his family. The Food and Agriculture Organization was set up in 1945. Its main task then was to document the situation as far as world food production was concerned. But before very long, we found ourselves the largest United Nations agency for bringing technical assistance in the field of agriculture to the members of this organization, 107 in number. Since we were created about 20 years, just over 20 years ago, we've carried out more than 2,000 missions in more than 120 countries. We have utilized the services of 1,200 experts of 90 different nationalities. We normally recruit these men, these experts, from universities such as this, from private concerns, from public businesses, any source where we can find men who know, and we send them to live and work in the developing countries where their special knowledge has application. We find our work divides broadly into three separate fields. Clearly and most importantly, ways and means of increasing crop production and the production of livestock. Secondly, in finding areas in the world on which more crops could be grown than are grown at present. And thirdly, in preventing wastage. Preventing wastage of food is probably the easiest way of securing more food. Simply because if you save food being wasted today, there is more food tomorrow. Nobody knows the extent of wastage in the matter of food in the world today. It's my belief that if we did know, and if the developing countries themselves in particular knew, then far more would be done about saving wastage. In my country, though we do practice all sorts of measures of controlling pest and disease, we believe that we lose the produce of roughly one farm out of every 7. That is to say, we waste food, despite all our efforts, to the extent of something like $45 million a year. In your country, in which no country in the world has more effective practices for controlling pest and disease, no country in the world uses as much as you do of pest control chemicals. You use more than 150 million pounds of it every year. No country in the world has more data than you have of the cost benefit of using chemicals for the control of pest and disease. And you'll tell us that by the expenditure of one item, you can bring back 5 times as much food. And yet even here, data provided by our own Department of Agriculture indicates that the losses of selected crops can be between 4 and 14%. We've been trying to assemble a little data of what wastage occurs, because agriculture is an outdoor occupation. The moment the seed is planted, it is subject to attacks from pest and disease all the way through its growing period. Even after harvest, when it gets into the store, it is possible that much food can be lost. The result of our inquiries indicates that not less than 1/4 of everything the world's farmer produces never reaches the dinner table. It's taken by rats, mice, birds, pest, disease, and so forth. This is an enormous quantity of food. It is food for more than 1 billion people. If only this could be saved, the world food situation would take a turn for the better. But while this wastage is going on, It is sheer cruelty to suggest that in a world where 10,000 people die every day from hunger, that we can afford to share our limited food with pest and disease. One of the greatest sources of the wastage of crops in past years, at any rate, has been the desert locust. The desert locust has been known throughout the world ever since the time of the pharaohs, whose message I read you when I started my talk. The trouble with the locust is twofold. Firstly, it is mobile, always moving, and secondly, it is always hungry. In order to remain alive, a locust has to eat 3 times its body weight in green stuff every day. And if you take a small swarm, say a swarm of locusts comprising 1,000 million insects, that's quite a small swarm. For every day that swarm is undetected, it consumes 3,000 tons of green stuff. That is food for 60,000 cattle, wasted every day. The other problem which we face with the locust is its mobility. The moment it gets wings, it flies, and the winds take it all over the face of the globe, and nobody knows where it is. Our early attempts to control the locust didn't succeed, simply because we could never find where these locusts were breeding. Because, quite naturally, the natives of the locality wouldn't tell us, because at that stage in their lives, the locust is eaten as a food. Not a very stimulating food, one would have thought, but nonetheless, no one is going to tell you where the locust is if he has an idea he's going to eat it for his Sunday lunch. And it wasn't until we were able to get countries to cooperate together that we finally got the locust under control. I was walking down one of the corridors of FAO not so long ago, and I met Dr. Vallega, who is in charge of our locust work in the Food and Agriculture Organization. And if ever I saw a depressed-looking man, it was Dr. Vallega. His shoulders were drooping and his head was fallen. He really looked a man in a picture of misery. And I said to him, "Oh, Dr. Vallega, what's the matter? Anything happened?" "Yes," he said, "there are no locusts." Even though that meant that his work had been wholly successful, he was so discouraged because there were no locusts for him to fight. Locust today isn't the problem that it was, but this freedom from the attacks of the locust can only be preserved through keeping a very careful watch on the situation to see that the insect doesn't accumulate again as it once did. The second point I mentioned as being part of our work is the improvement of crops. If you take the broad sweep of the developing countries, you will find that the yields of their principal crops are less than a quarter the kind of yields you get in your country and I get in mine. This is due to many things. It's due partly to poor quality seed. We, in our countries, have been breeding new varieties of seed and better seed for our own farmers to use. These are now available to the peasant farmer if they are suitable to the climate in which he works. The hybrid varieties of corn which you have developed in this country and which can out-yield the old varieties you grew here by something like 40% are of immense value and will be of increasing value to the peasant farmers in the developing countries. And we are trying to help him to get supplies of these, hoping that he will be able to use them in his own circumstances and increase food production to that extent. Our plant breeders are producing new varieties of cereals constantly and making them available to the hungry countries. Mexican varieties of wheat, for instance, produced in that country are now widely used in many parts of the world, in particular in India, in Pakistan, in the Middle East, and in North Africa. We could get from 50 to 60 million tons more food if we can persuade and help and encourage the peasant farmer to use these new and more rewarding varieties. In many parts of the world, growing crops is difficult because of the lack of water, because of the very limited supplies of water. And in many cases, the addition of supplemental water in the form of irrigation is almost essential. With the supply of water, it is possible, as we have seen in many of these countries, to grow 2 or even 3 crops a year instead of the more usual one. Crop yields with the use of adequate supplies of water can increase 4-fold. We carried out some little demonstrations in India not very long ago, very, very simple demonstrations, which involved digging a little mound all round the edge of the fields in which the farmers were going to grow their crops. The idea of putting this ridge round the field was to keep the monsoon rain where it fell on the field and let it soak in instead of rushing off and taking with it a lot of the topsoil. And in 1966, I went back to this village and talked with the farmers. My purpose was to try and find what had happened as a result of this little experiment which we asked them to make. You won't find this little town on the map. Its name is Mada. It isn't on any road, and you have to walk quite a long way from the main road before you reach this little village. My arrival had been expected, and the 3 farmers concerned with this little experiment were waiting for me in the village square under the only tree there was. And we sat down together on a broken-down bedstead and prepared for our discussion. Farmers are the same all over the world, you know. They never discuss what you want to discuss until they've more or less covered everything else first. And I find in working with farmers all over the world, there are 3 things they want to talk with you about first before they're prepared to talk about what you've come to talk about. The first thing, of course, is the disastrous prices they get for their food. Whether a farmer comes from England or America or Pakistan or India or any other country, that's the first thing he'll tell you about, the terrible prices. When he's exhausted that subject, he'll turn around and he'll talk about the bad weather. The weather is always bad for farming, apparently. And he'll go in great detail into that subject. Then when he's exhausted that, he'll turn to another subject which is very dear to his heart, and that is the general wickedness of the government. Those 3 subjects out of the way, then he'll prepare to talk to you about things that you want to know. And I asked bluntly, well, how did this experiment turn out? There was a dead silence. I felt sure that something must have gone drastically wrong to have afforded this great doubt. At last, one of the farmers couldn't contain himself any longer, and he said in a great rush, last year our crops of wheat were 15 times greater than they've ever been before, just as a result of preventing the monsoon rain from running off this field and keeping it there to soak in and thoroughly moisten the soil. As I walked out of this village back to my jeep, I couldn't help noticing that the goddess, little effigy of the goddess of fertility, which stood on this side of the road, had received another coat of color wash, just in case she had anything to do with this great increase in yield. You can't be too careful, obviously. But crops can be starved just like people. Some form of manure, some form of fertilizer is necessary if crops are to grow up to the potential of the seed which is sown. Out of a total world production of fertilizers of something like 30 million tons of plant food, only 1/10 is used in the developing countries, despite the enormous need for more food. Over the past 3 years, we in FAO have carried out something like 100,000 demonstrations in 21 different countries of the effect of the use of fertilizer. As a result of these experiments in those countries, the demand for fertilizer instead of increasing at 1% per year, is going up now at the rate of 50% per year. Peasant farmers aren't so slow after all, are they, to take note of something new, provided the new idea is within their compass to carry out, provided they can pay for the results. Experiments we have carried out with the use of water and fertilizer indicate that you can almost guarantee a crop increase sevenfold over what is usually received. There are two very substantial advantages in the use of fertilizer, above all other means of increasing food production. In the first place, you can use small quantities. You don't have to lay out a lot of money, as you would have to do if you were buying a tractor. You can buy a small bag and try it first. And secondly, its results are quick and easy to see. You can measure the results. Truly, the use of fertilizer is the spearhead in this battle against hunger. Without the increased use of fertilizer, the feeding of the world is absolutely impossible. It is therefore not surprising that many governments of the developing countries today are offering subsidy prices to their farmers to use fertilizer for the first time in their lives. You know in your country, and I certainly know in mine, of the enormous advantages which animals can bring to a developed agriculture. Livestock in most of the developing countries plays no part whatever in agriculture other than as a means of draft. A farmer's status in society is judged by the number of cattle he's got. Just numbers. Condition doesn't matter at all. They can be old, they can be diseased, they can be infertile, they can be useless. But the fact that he has them is a measure of his status in society. Their manure is never returned to the soil. They're only used as means of draft and as a means also of carrying out the farmer's obligations of hospitality and of tribal ceremony. We have been trying to get the farmer over the past few years to integrate his livestock, as you do and as we do, with his system of farming. In the first place, oddly enough, though our target is to increase livestock production, oddly enough we find the first step that we're obliged to take is to reduce numbers of livestock rather than increase them, in order that those that remain can be better fed. One of the greatest shortages the world is suffering from today is the shortage of protein. This is why infant mortality in the developing countries can be 18 times greater than it is here in America. That is, the shortage of protein is why more than 16.5 million children will die before they reach their first birthday, a shortage of protein. And the difficulty which these children experience in moving from when they are weaned onto an adult diet. Medical men have told us more recently how they suffer a setback both mentally and physically to their growth, which they often never recover all their lives. They are unable throughout their lives to play a full part in their country's welfare. Clearly then, one of our biggest targets must be to try to increase the level of protein production. We just concluded a very big program in India where the problems are probably greater than anywhere else. Here, in the past, we have been able to gather together 120,000 little peasant farmers, none of them occupying more than 2 acres and none of them having more than 2 animals. We've induced them to cooperate together to use better methods of animal husbandry, to use the veterinary surgeon to keep the animals healthy, and to manage the animals in a better way to increase production. 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we came, in spite of all these advances, up as high as we could get. The stumbling block then was the shortage of food. It hadn't been customary in that country to feed animals a supplementary ration of grain. All they'd been able to get was what they could pick up. But as a result of a contribution from your country of 16,000 tons of corn, we were able to prepare a balanced ration suitable for livestock. And this we gave to the farmers for the first week or two. But when the effect began to show in increased milk production, we started to put a charge on this. And at the end of 6 months, the farmer was paying the world price of this supplementary and balanced feed for livestock. In the course of our work, for some reason or another, the supply of this feeding stuff broke down. Either the truck couldn't get through because of the monsoon rains or something, and we looked as though we were going to face a complete disaster, because we had encouraged and helped farmers to look to use this kind of food to increase milk production, from which their income would naturally increase equally. But what could have been a disaster actually turned out to be the best thing that could possibly have happened, because within 4 or 5 days the milk yield started coming down, and with the lessening milk yield, the farmer's income was less. He saw straight away in the best possible demonstration of the value of this additional cattle feed which he was now able to buy. And in the course of about a week, the milk supply had dwindled by 20%. This was very obvious and was the best talking point we could possibly have had as to the value of this additional feed for livestock. A third of my last point of the main features of our work in FAO has been to make better use of land and water. The earth is prodigal in the amount of land it has for each person. There are more than 10 acres of land available for every person living on earth today. Unfortunately, we're only using 1 acre out of the 10. Possibly another 3 or 4 might be usable, but the majority is either too cold or too hot or too rocky or too dry. And at present, our scientific and technical knowledge doesn't allow us to bring all into cultivation as we should like. The biggest area of unproductive land in the world today must be the deserts. Deserts exist in 57 different countries, marring the people's work, reducing their ability to feed themselves, and spoiling their lives in general. There are more than 12,000 million acres of desert today, and the evidence is that most of it has been made by mankind. One of the most important pieces of work which the State of Israel has done is to learn ways and means of bringing this dead land back to cultivation. Theirs is a limited country limited in size, with quite a large population. And some of the work which has been going on in Israel, which is now available for all others to see and to copy, is the most spectacular advance that we can show anywhere in the world. The Bible will often tell you what this kind of land was like years and years ago in the dim ages of history. Either from that or from rock paintings, you get a pretty good idea that much of this desert land was fertile in those days. After all, the present desert of the Negev in southern Israel was the land of Beersheba in the days of the Bible, a land which was said to be overflowing with milk and honey. There are equal opportunities to improve production of the seas, as we've discussed briefly, as existing in improving the yield of the crops and of livestock. 7/10 of the Earth's surface is undersea water, and yet man only draws up from the sea less than 1/100th part of what he needs for his food. We only use a few dozen of the species of fish when we know that there are more than 20,000 species available in the sea. Much of our work in helping people to feed better is to teach them better ways of fishing, the use of better boats, the exploitation of knowledge of the life of the fish, where they are, where they can be found. And above all, we are teaching them not to overexploit the sea, otherwise there'll be nothing to fish in a few years' time. Some of our work in encouraging increased production, particularly from the sea, has been very successful in Ceylon and has resulted merely from providing a very inexpensive and small motor which allows the Ceylonese fisherman to take his boat further out to sea than he could otherwise do by the use of sails or of oars. About 4 years ago, at the request of the government of Ceylon, we went into that country and we provided a dozen outboard motors. And we gathered the fishermen together and we say we believe that there are many fish available just beyond the limit that you can reach with your sails or with your oars. We proposed, with your agreement, to put these motors to your boats, to allow you to use them, and we'll come back again in a year's time, and if you don't like them, then we'll take them away again and restore your boat to its present condition. When our fishermen went back there after a year, they found the whole atmosphere of this village had changed, because these little motorized fishing boats were able to bring back 10 times as much fish as they had been able to return using sails and oars. Of course, there were some accidents. On the first occasion, a young fisherman, getting on towards lunchtime, looked for a place in his boat where he could fire up his little brazier and cook his lunch. He'd always done this in this turn of the boat before, and the stern of the boat seemed to be the right place to look now, especially as there's a nice flat area on the top of the petrol tank. And that is where he built his little fire. And that is what started the boat burning. All this, I suppose, is a matter of education. As industry develops all over the world, hundreds and hundreds of square miles of water are being dammed up for hydroelectric works. All of these are capable now of producing a crop of fish every year. So those who live far from the sea do not necessarily lack fish. All these things are being done today. All of these things can be done anywhere in the world where food is short. We can provide enough food if man only wants it. I do not believe that peace can have any meaning. It may even be unattainable unless the people of the world have finally overcome the evils of hunger, of poverty, and of privation. The weapons for this fight against hunger are not the conventional weapons of war, but wheat and cotton, meat and wool, timber, rice and fish. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are terms that translate into every language on earth. Thank you.
I believe Professor Anderson has some slides that he can show you, and after the slides, I know he would be pleased to answer questions. Shall we have the slides?
Yes, do ask us.
Yes. Could we have the slides now? You want this on?
No. This is a hungry child. This is a child suffering from third-degree malnutrition. This is one of the 16.5 million children who are unlikely to reach their first birthday. This is a young lady from Botswana in Africa. She is another of these millions of children who are having difficulty in getting used to an adult diet. We are helping through the development of better weaning foods, through the making available of more supplies of protein, helping to cut down this dreadful loss of human life. poverty we're going to have to deal with in very large areas of the world. Here is the Tanzanian farmer. He lost his land. He had to borrow money from the moneylender, and the interest was too high for him to carry, and he's lost his land. He's another man whom we're going to have to help and restore in some way. We're going to find some very funny land to work with, land which is low in fertility. This is a typical area of land in Tanzania. Very poor, very rocky, very hot. The erosion, too, it has damaged huge areas of the world which formerly on which formerly food was produced. The deserts, too, are increasing in size almost every year, yet many of these can be brought back to life using the proper techniques. Arid areas which haven't produced food for many centuries can be brought back into production by the use of practices and techniques which we now know. Here's one. This is an irrigated area in the Sahara, north part of the Sahara. There's quite a big supply of water in underground Sahara, which we're now utilizing over the whole of this area of one of the largest deserts in the world. Here is a picture not only of a very starved, a very hungry animal, but a picture of the area I spoke of in Mada, where the creation of these little bunds, as they call them, has kept the water from the monsoon rain on the field. A very simple device, as you see, which can be carried out without expensive tools and without any great cost, which increases food production to such a remarkable extent. This is one of the wonders of the world. This picture was taken in the Philippines. These are rice paddies carved out of the hillside more than 3,000 years ago. A great proportion of the, carry on please, a great proportion of the world's peoples have rice as their main diet, and hence work which we can do in improving rice varieties, improving means and methods of cultivation of rice is going to affect a very large number of people. Here is a picture taken in the Philippines where farmers are cooperating together to carry out their cultivation of a neighbor's rice paddy using the buffalo as the means of draft. Here are rice paddies all planted up with new varieties which have been bred specially for short straw and for a high yield. In many of these areas today, farmers are actually growing fish at the same time. As the water comes up, fish go into these rice paddies, and when the water disappears at harvest time, the fish are used to improve their diet. Here's one of our experimental farms. We call it a farm, it's rather perhaps over-dignifying it, but these are new varieties of rice bred by plant breeders all over the world, which we are testing under the circumstances of this particular country, so we can give farmers better varieties to grow and hence better yields and higher incomes. Sometimes we in our work must involve teaching farmers how to grow different crops. This is a picture taken in the area I spoke of in India a few moments ago, where milk production so tremendously increased in the course of our assistance with cattle feed. In addition to providing the raw materials for a balanced ration for these livestock, we're teaching the farmer to grow alfalfa for the first time. He gets very enthusiastic about this, and I was told In 3 years, the area of alfalfa had gone up by 700%, which is a remarkable achievement to bring about so quickly. The implements which a farmer uses in the developing countries today were probably designed many, many hundreds of years ago. I do not think that we're going to see the development of mechanization to the extent which you and I know it in the developing world for a very long time to come. For one reason, anything up to 85% of the people living in the country can work and live on the land and extract their living therefrom. If you were to mechanize to any great extent, you would probably bring about a greater problem of unemployment than you're currently facing. Nonetheless, I believe our help in the Western world can be very effective in improving the tools which the farmer is already accustomed to using, developing with him as his expertise and as his income increases. This is an Indian plough which has been demonstrated to me by an Indian farmer. You see how simple it is. It hasn't altered a bit, possibly for 2,000 years. All this big area used to be a nobleman's park, and that's all that remains of his mansion. Instead, all round this park is now an earth wall, an earth dam to hold the monsoon rains. That is, if you can just sharpen that up a tiny bit, it's a bit out of focus. That is one of the principal implements which farmers in this part of India use. Just a log drawn by 2 animals, and the farmer perches on it for as long as he can. A very, very simple implement which we could easily improve upon without any great expenditure. Here again are farmers in Tanzania being shown a roughly constructed seed drill in which their seed can be deposited in the soil rather than broadcast in the usual way. We in our countries have used the seed drill for many centuries. We find we get better yields as a result of putting the seed well into the soil. This is on the road from Damascus out to the Syrian desert. About 18 months ago, I went to the very heart of this desert, which was something like 150 miles beyond where the road finished, beyond where this road finished, to talk to some Bedouin nomads, nomadic Arabs, whom we had been working with in an endeavor to improve their sheep. I suppose nomads all over the world are the most forgotten men on earth. All their lives they spend traveling across vast areas of the desert, following the rains, the sparse rains, where it is likely that a little grass may grow for their sheep. If their sheep put on any weight, any fat, walking to where the rains have fallen, they'll walk it off again the next day when they come back again. Nomads cover most of the arid areas of the world and lead possibly one of the most difficult and discouraging lives of anybody on earth. Here is a picture taken in the desert. That is the kind of, could that be just slightly sharpened up a bit? That's it. This is the kind of tent they use, all which folds up and puts on the donkey back, and away they go with their families and their sheep to find sources of grazing when they've exhausted what is in the locality. Here is a nomadic family on the move. You can see the arid and rocky and dry area they're leaving with their sheep, with their donkeys, with the family, searching for better areas of land. Now, we've been trying to persuade these people that it would be far better if they were to settle and abandon their nomadic habits, so they could cultivate the soil, so they could feed their sheep. And we got agreement from 2 tribes of Bedouin that they would just try this. And we provided a little quantity of oats, in order that these animals should be better fed for the market. In the past, the merchant used to travel out to where these nomadic flocks and herds were, and he offered the least possible price for the animals, because he knew very well that the Bedouin shepherd had no alternative but to sell it to the merchant. Very often he would buy 2 sheep and then demand another as a free gift in order to pay for the transport. And we saw that under these circumstances, the Bedouin people had no opportunity to advance themselves at all in life. Now this, to you and to me, looks like a desert. To me, it looks very arid, very little growing. To a Bedouin farmer, that's a good pasture. Nobody knows what the sheep thinks about it, but that's the sort of stuff these animals subsist on. Here is where we're getting near the Bedouin encampment, and in addition to providing a little feed for these sheep, we are also indicating through the collection of 20 or 30 animals of the right kind, we're helping to instill in the farmer's mind the idea that it is better to breed from the best he's got rather than to breed from everything indiscriminately. After all, if a Bedouin family is to settle and to try and improve the grazing, improve the feeding of its animals, it is unlikely to be able to feed the large numbers of sheep which they normally have. And we have been trying to get them to determine the qualities of the animals from which they should breed. These are the famous Awassi Syrian breed, who can live and put on a modicum of fat at any rate under the most arid and starving conditions. Here is our shepherd. We hired him to look after this little demonstration flock, and this is his favorite ram. When I caught him here, he was feeding this ram with grains of oats one at a time. He told me very proudly that he wasn't a Bedouin anymore. He was a civil servant because he was employed by the government. What worried him was that the government had told him the day before I arrived that they were taking part of his salary away in order to pay him a pension when he got too old to work. I said that was a splendid thing to do because that's what they were doing to me. And he replied, well, if you excuse me for saying so, when our government gets hold of any money, it never lets it go again. And he may very well be right. After 3 years, these are the kind of sheep these Bedouin were taking to market. Already, in 3 years, they'd got rid of the incubus of the traveling merchant who gave the minimum possible prices for animals. The animals were better looking, they were better fed, they were fatter, and the Bedouin themselves were taking them into the market here at Hama, just off the desert, and were selling them for themselves. The sheikh of this tribe told me that as a result of better feeding of animals, which they'd never done before in their lives, their income had gone up in 3 years by 45%. We talked with them as to what next, what would you like us to do now? And they said there's one thing we need, and that is a school. No Bedouin child has ever been to school, because when the school opened, the child wasn't there. It was probably 200 miles away with its family, with father and mother and family. The result was that any Bedouin child who wants to leave this very difficult life and find employment in the town can only think of the most menial tasks because none have had any education. And as a result of the success we've achieved in growing better sheep, this year we have started a school in this area. It only has 2 classes, one for the younger children to teach them reading and writing, and the other for the 17-year-old boys to teach them how to keep sheep and to grow sheep and to fatten sheep in this terribly dry climate. India, these are native Indian cattle. There are too many of them, as you see, and any improvement work which we undertake in India starts off with reducing the numbers of livestock. We do not believe it is sensible to take into India breeds of cattle from other parts of the world. Too often we've been disappointed with the inability of the incoming breed to stand the local climate, the local diseases, the local temperatures, and we find it is far better to try to improve on what the Indian farmer already has. This is a fairly typical sight almost anywhere in India at certain times of the year. Too many cattle, too little grazing. Here again. This animal isn't likely ever to contribute very much to human welfare. Yet they can be improved if you select carefully the best animals, the most healthy ones, breed from them, feed them better, look after their health, and manage them better. Above all, you can make the biggest possible strides in supplies of protein for this part of the world. Here again, occasionally you'll find good animals, or by using artificial insemination you can breed better animals, high-yielding animals, and this automatically brings you to the state when you've got to feed them better than they've been accustomed to in the past. Here are some cattle in Kenya. Selected, these bulls are now used for artificial insemination. The farmer in future will never have to depend upon his old, poor quality animals. He can get his semen for breeding from government stations, from specially selected animals who have already proved themselves as producing high-yielding offspring. Disease control is one of the most important aspects of looking after animals. And this is a local young veterinarian on this side of the screen being taught by one of our own FAO vets how to inoculate an animal against rinderpest. Rinderpest has been one of the biggest scourges that livestock have faced for centuries. In China, even today, more than 1 million cattle die every year from a disease which now need never occur. Fish, tremendous opportunities improving the yield of the sea. In many areas of the world, fishermen are only at the hunting stage. Just before I left Rome 3 months ago, I was talking with a colleague of mine, Arnold Meshkat, who spent most of his life in the Amazon, helping fishermen there to improve their catches. He told me when he went there that the only way they had of catching fish was by bow and arrow, shooting the fish in the water. And naturally, their catches were not very high. He had with him a net, and he showed these fishermen a net for the first time in their lives. And he demonstrated how it could catch more fish. Even though they saw the increased catch which he got as a result of using the net, they took no interest at all in it. They said, it's nothing to do with the net, this is the magic which you have got in you, which enables you to catch all these fish. And Arnold Meshkat's reply to this was to call all the village kids together and give them the net, let them catch fish. And the fishermen, their fathers, knew very well whatever the kids had got, they had no magic, and they were persuaded that nets were better than bows and arrows for catching fish. That, I think, is our last picture. This is one of the species of fish which are being grown in many parts of the world now in industrial waters dammed up for hydroelectric works and so on and so forth. And that, I think, is the last picture which I have to show you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Anderson, for a most interesting talk. And now do we have questions? Does anyone have any questions to ask? Yes.
You say the only difficulty is in applying the technology that we already have. And FAO has obviously done a lot of experimentation. What is the main obstacle now? Is it the fact that the test is being taken so long to learn new methods, or is it the lack of money?
The question, in case you all didn't hear it, was what is the main obstacle now? I believe that there are many obstacles, of course, and when you get one out of the way, then another one gets added importance. I believe the biggest obstacle to food production today in many countries is the system on which the farmer holds his land. In many areas of the world, almost feudal circumstances still exist, in that the farmer or the cultivator returns to the landowner, who's often an absentee landlord, a proportion of his harvest. Now that proportion is infinitely variable. It only remains as it is until some neighbor offers the landlord a bit more, and the first farmer is then dispossessed of the land he has been farming. Under those circumstances, a farmer knows that any methods which he puts into operation to improve his yield, the whole cost is going to be borne by him, whereas a larger proportion than ever will go to the landlord in return for the rent. In many cases, the landlord occupies a very important position in the community. He has great power, great prestige, and he does not like to see any of his tenants improving their circumstances, because he sees in that a threat to his authority. And so in many, many cases, farmers are actively discouraged from increasing food production. Nonetheless, in many, many countries of the world today, you will find systems of land tenure are being improved. As one country, for a most recent example, if you take the country of Iran, where the far-sighted king of Iran has brought new measures of land tenure onto the statute book, many other countries are following suit, realizing that unless a man holds land with some security, unless he is able to reap from it the full benefit of the improvements he makes, we aren't likely to see any great increase in food production. And this is another problem out of the way. And when we get that problem out of the way, I have no doubt we shall find others.
Yes.
I don't think we can hear very well down here.
I understand that 1977 is given as a year where there will be mass famine, and the drier prophecies are that there is nothing that can be done at this point to be able to increase food production and decrease world population to avert this famine.
The question was that it has been said that 1977 is the time point at which we're likely to see mass starvation taking place again. We believe that, taking all aspects of food production, all possibilities into consideration, that we are bound to see isolated famines reoccurring in some parts of the world about 1980. We do not think that unless governments will put into operation better means of increasing and encouraging food production, we do not think it can be avoided. Nonetheless, we've seen in so many areas what can be done if, in the first place, farmers are given the right incentive to produce food. A farmer is a human being like all of us. And if we make it worth his while to grow food, he will grow food. I was literally astonished 2 years ago when I was in India, and it appeared as though we were on the fringe of of a tremendous crop reduction as a result of the failure of the monsoon rains. I was astonished to find that farmers were not growing food crops, but growing crops for sale, oil crops, cotton, and all the rest of it, simply because it was more profitable for them to grow those kind of crops than to grow food crops. If you give the farmer the right incentive, then he will grow what you want him to grow. That is quite certain. Farmers all over the world are just like that. And we believe that if the governments, as they are already turning to do, 10 years too late, looking at the farmer's point of view, realizing that it's a mistake to try to develop industry before developing agriculture. That was one of India's great problems. Way back in her second 5-year plan, nearly all her resources were being put to improving industry. This year, for the very first time, more than half of the country's total resources are going to improve agriculture. And we're going to see a tremendous difference in India in the next 2 or 3 years or so. I doubt whether we shall see the famines that we might have anticipated in India had this far-sighted action not been taken. On the back row.
Will any production improvement always be accompanied by an increasing world population, such that we'll always have large numbers of hungry people, and someday the organic resources of the world will be depleted?
Well, this is a very difficult question to answer. The question is, if you produce more food, will there not be more people? I believe that unless a country achieves a certain level of development, then you're bound to get your increased number of people coming on in greater and greater numbers. And clearly the world of limited size cannot feed an unlimited number of people. And yet one normally finds that when a country has achieved a certain level of development, then the population ceases to rise as quickly as it did. Education is surely one of the most important things. How are you ever going to get a program of family limitation over to a country where you get a 90% illiteracy? How can you possibly communicate with people like that? It's extremely difficult. Nonetheless, the demographers who claim to know more about what we're going to do than we know ourselves believe that about 2000 we shall see a leveling off of the population. They seem to regard this as almost a certainty, and I think we should in the meantime make a great mistake if we were to assume that we could not cope with the present need for food, because there are too many instances where rising national income has accompanied a very rapidly rising birth rate. That's what happened in this country. That's what happened in Russia. It's happened in 2 or 3 countries. I don't believe that the fact that a rising population, knowing that it is there, is necessarily at variance with the ability to feed a larger number of people. And in any case, I do not think we have any alternative now. We certainly can't go back and allow these diseases to again appear when we know how to control them. Let's face it, I believe our principal motive in going to control these enormously punishing diseases was partly because we knew how easily they could spread to our own countries. So in a sense, we have a share in this task of keeping disease control where it is now. Lady in the back, right?
I'm interested in the budget of the FAO. I'm thinking that our world resources are certainly lopsidedly portioned out. Obviously, FAO is having effects that are important, but probably on fewer resources, less plans, etc.
Yes. One of the recent developments which we have undertaken in FAO with the assistance of your Alliance for Peace, with the assistance of the World Bank, of the Economic Community for Europe and other bodies of that kind, is to review country by country the possibilities for development in two time horizons, 1975 and 1985. Every country then has now its own plan for development. What are you producing now? What do you need to produce if your population is going to be adequately fed by 75 or 85? What is it possible to produce given reliable inputs? What possible contribution to your welfare can you look to from exports, and so on and so forth? What need have you for industrial development? What sort of industries would your agriculture support? And now today, for almost 90 countries, we are preparing development plans of that character, taking into account what they've got, what they could legitimately expect to get, what they could export, what they will need to import. And this, I think, for the first time will pinpoint the deficiencies as well as the abundances which countries could turn to export and so for export purposes and so forth. And this, what we call an indicative world plan, I think will measure those various aspects of the question which you raised a moment ago. It is only an indicative world plan insofar as you can only indicate. Now, what use the countries will make of this plan is obviously up to them. But I do believe, at any rate, every country who wishes will have on its own piece of paper its own possibilities so that it can channel its own limited resources into the most productive directions. You had a question in front, I think.
In India, how are you able to have any success in trying to reduce the number of cattle?
Yes, this is, I knew this question would come. This always comes. What about this problem of cattle in India? You've got to see it to really measure the enormous effect this is going to have. Cattle are increasing in India today to the extent of 2%. A very, very small proportion of them make any return whatever, and yet the religious beliefs of quite a large number of people prevent them from slaughtering these animals. I have never been able to see the difference between slaughtering an animal which was obviously sick, unproductive, and never likely to be productive, and tying a bull calf up in the sun where it would die from thirst. I just cannot see the difference. Yet that is what the farmers do. They do not want these bull calves, and if they're not allowed to kill them, so they tie them up in the sun and give them no water and no food, and that to me is very little difference from killing them. There is, however, a very considerable wave going through India at the present time against these old laws, these old religious beliefs which are handicapping the country. And we have recently been talking with the government of India of the possibilities of sweeping into a meat rendering plant a proportion of these utterly useless animals. We have chosen the area around Goa, and we have guaranteed the government of India $6,000 million in canned meat if she provides the animals to go into the cans. And this is happening now. Characteristically, the government says, well, now, we couldn't do this, but would you do this? And if anything goes wrong, then we can say, well, it isn't us, it's somebody else. And we have found a big meat canning firm to undertake this work, and things are changing. Even today in Delhi, where people of a certain caste are not supposed to eat beef, if you stand at the back of the butcher's shop after dark, you'll see lots of people going in to buy meat who would never go into the front door of the shop during daylight. Things are changing very, very, very quickly. And in this aspect of these millions and millions of unwanted cattle is one which we're going to see changed, I think, within the next 3 or 4 years. The signs are already there. One more.
What's been going on in the economy of China the last 15 years?
Well, the question is what is going on in Communist China? Well, that we don't know. Communist China is not a member of the FAO. It is not, as you know, a member of the United Nations. And I've got the feeling that if now, at long last, we welcome China into the United Nations, she'd probably refuse. We don't hear very much what is going on there, but we do notice that her purchases of cereals are increasing every year, which suggests that either the population is advancing very, very quickly, or their systems of agriculture are not adequate to take care of these people. We know very little indeed of what is going on in China, so I'm afraid I can't answer your question. Thank you.
I believe the tropical and subtropical regions of China are making a relatively small contribution to food needs. Would you appraise the prospects of increasing food production in these regions?
In some areas who have limited ability, I didn't quite catch your question.
Tropical and subtropical.
Oh, tropical, tropical. I can't think of a country in which we're working in which we do not find a reasonable opportunity of increasing food production, either for export or to feed the population. We normally never go into a country unless we're invited by that country to come for a specific purpose. And though we are working today in something like 107 different countries, I cannot recall any in which we have found no possibility of increasing production. In some it's more difficult than others, obviously, but in none, I think, do I know of one which we can say that there is no possibility here at all. I'm afraid I can't answer that question through our experience, anyway.
Well, thank you, Professor Anderson. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. I guess that concludes the discussion.
Thank you very much.